I don't think anybody really knows for sure how far back in time it was that the Native Americans first discovered these bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, but they were the first people to see them. The bluffs rising 200-300 feet above the mighty Mississippi down below, easily defendable, with the Yazoo River forming a natural barrier to the north and the Mississippi a natural barrier to the west. Later generations would put these natural fortresses to the test more fully, but that comes much later. Was life of the prehistoric settlers peaceful, or was theirs a constant upheaval over who would possess these beautiful bluffs with their crystal clear springs and streams and steep hillsides? Well, written history begins with DeSoto crossing to the north of this area in the mid-1500s. And then after DeSoto, it was better than 100 years before another European saw the great river. And by late in the 1600s, the French had built Fort St. Pierre up the Yazoo from where it converges with the Mississippi. And then the Spanish built Fort Nogales in an area that is today confined within the Vicksburg National Military Park. When this part of the country was included in the United States territory, the name of Fort Nogales was changed to Fort McHenry. And then during the war between the states, the Confederates changed the name again to Fort Hill. Well, the first name we know for the area now called Vicksburg, other than going by the name of the forts located here, was Walnut Hills. And then when Newt Vick laid out a town on this site, its name was changed to Vicksburg in his honor, although he didn't live long enough to ever see the town built. It was a rough and tumble river port in its early years, tamed somewhat before the devastation of the Civil War. Today, a picturesque area that just the mention of its name conjures up the same vision as the words Shiloh, Gettysburg, and Manassas bring to mind. So this, then, is the story of an era in history, the carving of a community from a wilderness, a coming into existence of a place, as exemplified in miniature of the whole in a house in its midst. A real rarity, a house that is a witness to almost all of the events and eras in the story of the making of Vicksburg. One residence that has been in existence almost since the inception of the town, and the architecture of the house symbolically mirroring the growth and taming of the community. One home still in existence that was born in the wilderness of the late 1700s and saw the coming of law and order in the earlier years of the 1800s, and then was draped in the opulence of the Old South in the mid-1800s, and was crushed like its rebellious nation in the war between the states, only to raise its proud head and not only survive but regain the grandeur of the past. One of the oldest homes in Vicksburg, survivor of the siege in spite of its precarious position a stone's throw from the battle lines, falling mysteriously silent for decades under the spell of two spinsters, rediscovered in the 1960s and gracefully put back into its original condition almost miraculously. The original portion of the home built by Andrew Glass, a notorious Natchez Trace outlaw by trade, and then expanded upon by the sheriff of a maturing Vicksburg, known as the Bob House during the siege days of the Civil War, and today known as McRaven.
It was, well, you know, it was a river port town. There was a lot of cotton shipping going out of Vicksburg. There was a lot of, well, in the earlier days, there was a lot of gambling going on along the river down there. Vicksburg had quite a bit of trouble with the gamblers earlier.
And it was fairly rough place at that time, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. They had to worry about the Indians. They kind of grouped up in a settlement because they were worried about Indian attacks. You know, Fort St. Pierre had been wiped out by the Indian uprising before, and it was still kind of on the outskirts. Of course, you know, Mississippi wasn't a state yet, and it's still a frontier area. And there wasn't any organized militia, per se. It was just kind of groups of individuals that banded together to protect themselves.
Well, Andrew Glass is one of the infamous Glass brothers that you read about in The Devil's Backbone. And, of course, they were highwaymen on the Natchez Trace. And they were very violent people and murdered many, many people in this area. And Andrew Glass built this back section in 1797.
Of course, you know, the Spanish, they didn't go unless you bothered them. They weren't going to say a whole lot to you or did something to them. And they protected a lot of those outlaws.
Oh, well, all of these things date from the period. If you look over on the wall there, there's Spanish armor from this period, because remember that this was part of Spanish West Florida when this section of the house was built. Look how tiny that is. Look at that breastplate and the stirrups that hang underneath it. Minuscule people as far as it goes. And of course, everything in this house, every section of this house rather, is furnished according to its period in time. So everything in here would date from this period, every bit of it as far as it goes. Rope beds like you see, and the whole bit. Dulcimers, the rabbit ear shotguns and powder horns, all original to the house, all of this. Well, you expected that, didn't you? But you can see now why the National Geographic magazine called this the time capsule of the South. This is all the original plasterwork on the walls. It's got horsehair in it. If you actually study the walls closely, you can see the ridges of the horsehair in it. Now, they got the color in here by taking blueberries, which they crushed and they made a dye, and they added it to the buttermilk paint, spread it right up on the wall. If you wanted reds, you used oxblood, blackberries to get black. They took soot right out of that fireplace over there, added it to that same buttermilk paint base, and look at the floorboards and baseboards where it hasn't worn away. They painted them black. They aid in housekeeping, if you can imagine that. You could have written your name in the filth, right? Now, some of this is age damage, but some of it is actually cannon damage from the siege. When we get outside of the house, I'm going to point back at this wall right here and show you that very clearly, okay? Tin was the plastic of that generation. They made everything in the world out of it. They made candle molds like you see here, light fixtures to light the way around the house, and that fixture above us is original to the house. It actually pulls down on chains. Take a look right here if we can. You'd pull that down, light the candle on the inside, and the shade, see, acts as its own counterweight to pull that back to the ceiling, see, getting it out of our way. The fire screen was woven by the local Indians here in the 19th century, and that would keep the swallows out of here in the summer months, right? And the rabbit ear shotgun and powder horn are both original to McRaven. Now, too, the gun was hung here, gentlemen, right above the fireplace, nowhere else in the room. They did not have bluing on these things in those days, and that would have rusted solid, and the powder would have gone bad if it got damp. And, too, the long church warden pipes were made of clay, and they gave you something to hold on to because the clay bowl got awfully hot, right? And that made the smoke cool as it rose up to you like so. And in those days, when you went to the tavern to have yourself a pint of Medford rum or a quart of ale, and that's how they did drink in those days, was in pints and quarts, just like they still do in Britain and parts of Germany. Remember that you wouldn't have carried this with you because you would have broken it along the way, right? But once you got to the tavern, you got your drink, you sat down by the fireplace, and over by the fireplace somewhere was a container of these, and you could draw one out, and you broke the tip off and threw those down in the coals. See right here, all these little broken pieces? When they were too short to use, they chucked that whole thing down in the fireplace, right? Now, they weren't charging you for these drinks individually. They chalked this up on a slate in the back of the bar, and you settled up before you went home. But if you started to get a little bit on the tipsy side, they'd come up to you and tell you, you better mind your P's and Q's. Better mind your pints and quarts, you're getting drunk, right? We still say that when we go to Grandma's. Mind your P's and Q's now.
The original portion of McRaven consisted of 2 rooms, each running the full width of the house. The one we've just seen up above, the bedroom and living chamber, and then this room down below, the kitchen.
Okay, we're back in 1797, and when this section of the house was actually built, there was a cooking fireplace in the wall where they cooked with long-handled skillets like those over an open hearth, and there was actually a dirt floor in here. Well, the Bobs came in 1849, and they modernized this place by filling that in, and they put the coal-burning range in here, they put the bricks on the floor, and in 1853 they purchased the ice box and placed it in here. And the last block of ice was delivered out here in 1948 when the plant went out of business. There's many items in here that are original to the house, and they're all of the period nonetheless, but take a look over here. These are kind of fun. We're all familiar with rolling pins, and that's a nice primitive one, but here's yet another form. And a lot of people can't imagine what this is for, but we all like ravioli, and this is exactly how you made it in those days. And on the table behind me are all sorts of things they would have had. In the dining room, we talked about the fact they had steel-bladed knives in those days, and that's a knife polisher. So you stuck that down inside there and turned the crank, and the brushes with brick dust would polish up these steel blades, almost like silver. And that's a coffee grinder from the Chancellorsville battlefield. And of course, there are irons from 1800 over there right up to about 1866. These are pleating irons for the big hoop skirts. They actually took coals out of the range and put down inside there to iron with. This is my favorite one because it's a fluter. This was to ruffle lace collars and cuffs. And they really thought people were stupid because look what they printed on the bottom of it. Heat this. Patented 1866. Read your instructions carefully. You may not be able to figure out how to use this. And then in 1856 right here, look, was the apple peeler, and that was patented at that time. See? That would spin around and peel the apple for you, and that would still work to this day. Up here is an egg poacher on the wall. There's a Civil War can opener. A lot of people don't realize the fact that they had cans during the Civil War, but they did. In fact, the Borden Company condensed and canned milk as far back as 1852. So it's something that's been around a long time. That pot rack dates from the 1750s. That's a nice piece of handmade primitive ironwork. And over here is a heart-shaped waffle baker for your waffles. See? You bake one side and then just flip it around and bake the other. And of course, take the waffles out like you see there. Up on the wall is a popcorn popper up there. All sorts of things. Bacon stilliards to weigh the bacon once it was all dried and cured. You know, when we came in, we talked about the long-handled skillets that they cooked over the open hearths with. Well, here they are, see? Look how big they are. And, of course, the chopping block's original to the house, and these are things that they would have had at that time. Bennington ware pieces. Right there is a spice caddy for, you know, ginger, nutmeg, whatever you wanted. A sugar shaker, you know, made of tin. Just all sorts of things. Even a butter mold, like you see there, to press, you know, out on the table, you know, make a pretty design on it. Now, in a lot of the places you hear people talk about hand-blown glass. Well, they no more hand-blew the glass for these houses, and then they blew the houses. This is pan glass. See all the wrinkles in it and the bubbles? They couldn't make big sheets of glass in those days because what they were doing is they poured molten glass into pans. And when it cooled, then they went ahead and took them out and put them on in the windows after they cut them. But that just gives you an idea there. Look up there at the cannon shell mark. Can you see the indentation in the wall in the shadows? That's a very obvious one, but great big mark. You know, it's amazing that there's much of this house left for people to see. That's a carpet beater. You know, in the bedroom upstairs, we showed you the bed beater. And up there's a tin tea box. That's a shaker spice cabinet, a mortar and pestle for grinding up spices, and Coca-Cola bottles right here. Now, Coca-Cola was invented in Atlanta, Georgia as a fountain drink, but it was bottled for the first time anywhere in Vicksburg, Mississippi at the Biedenharn Candy Company in 1894, and that's the bottle that they used right there. And it was indeed the real thing because it had cocaine in it right up until World War I when they made them take it out. So that gives you an idea of the early advertising brain food, as they called it. Right. All sorts of little things like, oh yes, it's exhilarating. Yeah, that's right. Of course it was. But nonetheless, take a look. Got Bennington ware pieces, ginger beer bottles for the men, any number of things. Up there on the wall is a set of ice tongs. All of us know this kind. And here's another form. See, these would actually lift the block of ice. And during the Civil War, they actually made cannonballs with slots that these would hook into, and that's how they carried some of the cannonballs in those days. So you see some of those at the military park here in Vicksburg. Up top there is a milk strainer. These are skimmers to get the clots out of cream. This is a butter tester. That's what they stuck down in a tall cylindrical keg of butter, pulled it out like this, and they could see if the butter was rancid anywhere down to the bottom of the keg. So that was a nice thing to have. That leather thong with the steel pin was put on the finger, and that's what you shucked the corn with in those days. That's a corn shucker. Little chopping mechanism to be used with a wooden bowl. That's a coffee grinder. These are nutmeg graters, and they took fresh corn and rubbed on this thing to make grits for breakfast, and they took the dried corn off of the cob, saving the cobs back for another function, and they put the kernels of the corn down inside here, and as you walked along the field, you stuck that in the ground, and that would dig a little hole for you, and it dropped a kernel of corn down the shaft, and that's a planter, so it saved you a lot of back-breaking work in those days.
In the 1830s and 1840s, Vicksburg matured. More and more, the wealthy plantation owners came here to trade and ship their cotton southward to New Orleans or northward to St. Louis. As the area civilized, the wilder element had to go.
Oh, Sheriff Howard has kind of an interesting story. Back in 1836, this town was overrun by slave traders, gamblers, dens of iniquity. Every violent act known to man was going on in this town. We had a worse reputation than New Orleans, and we had a 9 o'clock curfew. We even had a get out of Vicksburg day. And in the 1830s, when he was sheriff, a bunch of vigilantes, and he got hold of a bunch of these gamblers, right? And they hung a bunch of them right up here on Clay Street, up where the muffler shop is. There was a hanging oak tree, and they tied one to a log and set him adrift in the Mississippi, and he showed up in Natchez. He lived, no, but he showed up in Natchez.
Well, it was about this time that Sheriff Howard acquired McRaven and wrote the next chapter in the history of the house.
And it got to be an organized town and fairly good size at that time.
Okay, if we go back all the way to 1797, an early settler here named Andrew Glass built the back section of McRaven. All right, and he burned the bricks right here on the property, and he built one room up, one room down with double galleries or porches outside. Very typical frontier style of building. Very, very simple and primitive. And all this was behind a stockade fence. Remember, this was a very violent region. We were overrun by Indians and all sorts of slavers and, you know, just terrible people, violent people along the river. And then a few years after that, Sheriff Stephen Howard got control of the property, and he tore down the stockade fence like you see here, and he built this section of the house that we're standing in up against the double galleries of the 1797 structure. There they are behind me, see? Now what he did is he filled in on both ends of the galleries to make them into this interior hallway and staircase, and that's what the house looked like with the Howards living in it.
Well, Sheriff Howard's section of McRaven was not nearly as basic as the frontier dwelling he was adding on to, although his addition wasn't nearly as ornate as the front portion of the house built in Greek Revival nearly 2 decades later.
As we come back into this section, you'll see a complete change of architectural style. We're leaving all that high Greek Revival architecture with the heavy plasterwork and the higher ceilings, and you come back to the earlier Federal period. Look around at the pedimented doorways and window treatments, and instead of that heavy plasterwork, you've got stenciling, the same Greek design motifs, but this time they're painted onto the wall. And remember, too, that marble, like you see up front in the Carrara mantelpieces, was terribly expensive in the 1830s, so they painted their mantelpieces to look like marble. The technique is called faux marble. Even the baseboards are painted to resemble the marble. And even the ceiling medallion is stenciled, and the lamp up here is a colza burner. Burned a combination of rapeseed and cabbage seed oil in a blend. That nasty thing flickered and smoked the ceiling up black. And the rest of these lamps are all pressed lard burners, like over there, or whale oil burners. This pair of lamps here, this set rather, like on the mantelpiece in here, are called argon lamps. And they're interesting because this was the first time anybody, anywhere, figured out to put a chimney around the wick. The wicks in there are hollow, and this little bulb down here is the breather vent. The air went up through the center of the hollow wicks, and they would burn steadily and cleanly, unlike that filthy thing over the table. But bear in mind that they were cooking with the oil and that's why they were burning it in the first place. It was cheap. The table and chairs and all this furniture that you see around in the room is all made of mahogany in the 1830s, and it's in the American Empire style. And the Chinese export porcelain that you're looking at all around the room is called rose medallion. And this came over on board the clipper ships from Canton, China, from the 18th century up through the 19th century, packed in the holds of the clipper ships, and they used it as ballast till they got it over here, and then they sold it off. And this represents a very large collection. It's luncheon, tea, and dinner services for over 58 people. It's larger than the Roosevelt collection at the White House, and it's on documentation with the Smithsonian Institute. That's a dueling pistol from the 1830s, and I'm very ashamed to admit this is a family piece. So is the sword cane, a concealed weapon. But nonetheless, I want to point out that the last duel ever fought in the United States was fought in Vicksburg in 1898, so it's something that stayed with us a good length of time. And everybody here has heard the expression flash in the pan. You may think that comes from the early photographers when the camera went boom. Well, it didn't. It came from the flintlock mechanism in a pistol or a rifle. See, when that flint struck the pan and the gun did not explode, well, that's a misfire. That's a flash in the pan, right? Now, over here, we have all of Sheriff Howard's coined silver spoons. And in those days, the currency in your pocket was 9/10 sterling. And they would take this to a metal worker, and he would melt it down and make forks, spoons, or serving pieces, but obviously never a knife blade. The silver was too soft to use for knives. And they made forks and spoons, and the knives were steel. And all of these things have MEH on them. Mary Elizabeth Howard. The ladies had their monograms on things for the home, not the men. Not only was this a way of leaving her mark on the family, you've got to remember that the childbearing years left a lot of these people without a wife. All right? A lot of them died in childbirth. So this is a way of making sure that her children inherited her things, right? Not some other person's child. And this is how they maintained that.
Sheriff Howard's bedroom was directly above the dining room in his addition to McRaven. And you go out the back door of the dining room, up the stairwell in the enclosed gallery from the original portion of the house to get to the bedroom.
You know, when you travel around because of the movies and things like that, you expect to see all this fancy fabric up top and down below. Well, okay, granted, they did that along the eastern seaboard and up north and over in Europe, but not here. You've got to remember, we've got rivers, swamps, bayous, standing water everywhere around here in the South, and a terrible mosquito problem. It was bad back then, and it's just as bad now. And they had to have the mosquito net. See, we call it a mosquito bar. What happened is they used to pull the net forward on the brass rod, and that would hang all around the bed just like a great big tent. And about once a month, they'd come in, and they'd take the netting off the bed and the linens and carry them outside and put them in the great big cast iron cauldrons that they called a biling pot, and they'd boil all those up, and they would come back into the rooms with water, sulfur, and a rag, and they would wipe the beds top and bottom, saturating the bed ropes to kill out the bed lice that were teeming in these mattresses. If you had all that fancy fabric up top and down below, that was a breeding ground for these things. And let's face it, no dry cleaning, so this is the reality of the way they look. Now, too, anybody who started scratching around up here got sat down by a strong oil lamp, and they were gone through with the nitpick or the fine-tooth comb. And they, of course, they would pick out all the lice and lice eggs. And heaven help you if you had nice, tight, curly hair. Rip. Look at the teeth on that thing. A lot of people come into this house and they ask, why in the world were the beds so short in those days and the headboards tall? Well, there's a very good reason for it. Granted, people were little like me, but they believed something very strange that they believed all over the Western world, right? All over Europe and America. They thought in those days that if you lay flat down on a mattress, your lungs would fill with water and you'd strangle in the night. So there they were, all propped up on these great big headboards on great big pillows. See, like you see here? All propped up at about a 45-degree angle. That's what made the beds that much shorter. And, of course, there they all propped up with bed gowns for the ladies, night shirts for the men, nightcaps for all, and you had your rod pulled forward, and as hot as it gets down here in the South, they were doing something that they did all over the Western world. They still do this in parts of Europe, especially in France. They thought that the vapors rose from the earth at nighttime, and the dampness would settle in on your lungs, and that's what you contracted was called miasma. Right? Miasma. This is where we get our modern term asthma. But nonetheless, they would shut the shutters, close the windows, and draw the draperies down. All right? And here they were all shut up in this heat like you see, like that. And that's probably one of the very few historical accuracies in the movie Gone with the Wind, when Mammy's yelling at Scarlett about going out and that damp night air is fixing to set in, seeing she was going out without a shawl and she'd catch her death of dampness. Now, too, when they were dipping candles in those days, they would have actually made wax jack candles. See, like you see here, they dipped that piece of wick a couple times and rolled it up in a little roll, and that's how you lit your way around the house. Remember, matches were handmade and very expensive. You guys would have had a tinderbox in your pocket to light your pipes or cigars and light the fireplace, but you lit your way around the house like so. And that's a set of candle snuffers to snuff out the wick, and not only are you extinguishing the flame, you're cutting the black bead off the end there so it won't smoke up and make the, you know, nasty smell. But this is where you get the expression, cut the light. Cut the light when you leave the room. We still say that. Cut the TV off, cut your computer off. See, so all these things are still with us. And this piece has a wonderful little story behind it, and I'd like to lift off this old Bible and show you. This came out of Claremont Plantation down in Port Gibson, and when the Federal soldiers came into that town, which Grant called the town too beautiful to burn, his men went into Claremont, and they told Miss Reedus to open her husband's plantation desk, thinking there'd be money or documents that they wanted to get hold of in here. Well, she politely refused, and they politely opened it for her with the bayonet. Look where they patched in right there, and see how it's cracked all the way across the front here. Not everybody had their own bed in those days. See, you'd have all the boys in one room and possibly in one bed, all the girls in another in the same deal, and mom and dad in here, and possibly they'd have a sick child or a brand new baby, and you put that child in the trundle bed that was kept up underneath, so you'd slide that out, and the net over here is much wider than it is on the other side of the bed, and see, that would be pulled out, and everybody was covered up and kept the mosquitoes off of. See, so that was clever. Now, if you had a brand new baby and you didn't have a cradle, you just cleared out the top drawer of a dresser and put the child in there, and that's where you do get the expression for something that's top drawer, right? That's your prized possession, your kid, okay? Now, too, this is a billy club or a nightstick. This is what Sheriff Howard would have carried with him on patrol in town at night in Vicksburg. That is made of walnut. It was drilled out, weighted down with lead, and then it was wrapped with leather. You pop somebody in the back of the head with that, they're going to turn and run next time they see you. Now, too, this room is basically the main attraction as far as the haunting of this house is concerned, and regardless what you think of that, Mary Elizabeth Howard, Sheriff Howard's wife, died right after delivering her husband a child in 1836, and that's her funeral notice up right there that you see, and we'll talk about that later in the tape. Okay, over here on the wig dresser, we've got some articles that belong to Mary Elizabeth Howard, who died in this room. We've got her books, the jewelry box belonged to her, the opera glasses, the calling card case all belonged to her. And these were personal effects left over from her and their stay in the 1830s. Now, this is all on top of what's called a wig dresser. You know, down in the parlor, we talk about the fact the ladies cut their long hair off, and they saved it back and made it into false buns, braids, and curls that they wore at a later time. This is where they kept all of this, and they pinned it on, see, and made all these fancy hairdos. And the men shouldn't really laugh about the women doing this because they did it too. They wore toupees or full wigs in those days if you couldn't grow a beard, and remember that facial hair to the 19th century male was very, very important. Everybody had it. You would order false ones that came out of the backs of magazines like Harper's Weekly, etc. And the false beards hung over their ears with hooks. False mustaches were pasted on with gum arabic, and of course they even pasted on sideboards. And you think, what am I talking about, sideboards? They call them sideburns now, and it's because of the General Burnside, who was a Union general during the Civil War, who had the great big leg of mutton chops right here, and his men nicknamed those sideburns, and it stuck, and that's why we call them that to this very day. So nonetheless, all of these things give you an idea. But take a look here. All this furniture in here was made in the 1830s. It's all constructed of mahogany, just like the furniture down in the dining room, and it is in the American Empire style. Okay, this is a knockdown armoire. They called it a knockdown because it's all doweled together with pegs. The only screws that are in it are where the hinges are. But all of this furniture in the 1830s in this room would have been easily broken apart to go flat into the Conestoga wagons to go west, young man. The 1830s was the beginning of that movement, and they were leaving the eastern seaboard and coming to this region that they called the Old Southwest. Now, after the Civil War, Texas, you know, New Mexico, and further west was called the Southwest, but we were it first. Now we're going to step on outside. Okay, in the front section of the house, in the Greek Revival building, we have sash weights and window ropes that hold the windows up. Back here, this is a little too early for that. The windows push up into place and brace with this little key or bracket. And two, this was a very modern idea for them at that time. This is called a jib door. The bottom part could be closed, and the top could be open to let air and light in, and of course that kept the baby from crawling out and falling off the porch and all that good stuff. If this was downstairs, that kept the dogs from coming in and getting on the furniture, or a snake from slithering up in here, which we do have that problem. And of course the whole thing could be closed down for privacy, just like you see here. And we use it as an actual door. Now, I'm the average height of man during the Civil War, so I really don't have to worry about this too awfully much, but please watch your head as we go through here, because this is a real noggin knocker. And we'll go out and take a look at some cannon damage before we go back on up front. Okay, if you will, remember that the river was actually only 6 blocks away in those days, and you could have seen it through the trees before they grew up so tall, and of course buildings got so large. But just bear in mind, 6 blocks away were all those Union ironclads firing in this direction. Okay, take a look under here, if you will, at the sloppy repair work. This is the worst of it. Underneath the window there, on both sides of the shutters, you can see all that cannon damage and where they tried to patch in. Look even up above. But everywhere you look at on this house, you can spot it. The more you study the bricks, the more you see.
Vicksburg continued to mature, as did the South in general. A well-defined caste system emerged. There was the wealthy landowner, a middle merchant class, and the slave. But grandeur abounded for those who could afford it.
All right, now we're back in the 1849 section of the house, built by Mr. John H. Bobb. That's his portrait up there to the right of the door. He was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and when he came down here, he brought 2 brothers and a cousin, and together they founded a contracting firm in Vicksburg. He had the brickyard side of the business, so he represented a man of upper income for the period, and this is very typical of the type of structure he would have built for himself at the time. This is actually the finest example of Greek Revival architecture in Vicksburg, and it's also a direct copy of the Temple of the Erechtheion in Athens, Greece. The columns go up on both sides of the windows, supporting an entablature and decorative frieze-work that runs around the perimeter of the room. And in this period, all of this molding was painted white to resemble the marble of a Greek temple. And the marble overmantels are original to the house, and they came from Carrara, Italy. Now, the upper 2 regions of that molding up there are the heart and arrow and the egg and dart. They both stood for life and death. The broad bottom row is the palm and enthymeme, and that stood for friendship and hospitality. And the windows in the structure slide, in this front section, slide up into the body of the building, making full doorways, and you can walk right out onto the galleries from this point. Circulated air nicely into the room, too. The central ceiling medallion above us is original to the house, so is the gasolier. And this is solid brass in the morning glory pattern, and has all the original glass shades. And directly beneath this always stood a center table. This was the hub of activity in the Victorian parlor. It was the catch-all of that day and time, just like a coffee table in a modern home today. When a family finished an evening's meal, they would come in here, settle down, and entertain themselves before they went upstairs to bed. And children brought toys and games in here and laid them out just like you see. Photography was almost brand new at that time, and that was a source of entertainment, and that album is original to the house. And Mahjong came from 1840 over, from China on board the clipper ships, and that little set's original to the house. There's carpet balls to play like a big game of marbles at night when the kids couldn't go outside, and the stereopticon viewers were like having radio or TV in the building. This is the early form of the Viewmaster. We're all familiar with that, and just about everybody's grandparents have one of these up in the attic. But this is the double parlor version of it, and very rare. It holds 50 of the same cards back to back, and with the eye holes front and rear, 2 people could go through these cards, turn them as they go, and when they finished their side, they turned the box around and saw what their friend was looking at. And right over there is the early slide projector. That's a magic lantern, and you've got hand-tinted slides back here, as you can see, that go inside the little mechanism, and with the oil lamp behind, that would project a nice picture up on the wall for you. So all these things, were very modern at that time, even though they may look dated to us today, but they lived in these rooms and used them just as you see. You had decanter sets for the gentlemen's whiskey and brandy out. The ladies drank cordials and sherry, sweet wines. The men had the hard liquor, and they drank it by the shot. And, of course, you've got the decanter set with his shot glasses. Excuse me. And right there, of course, reading materials, glasses, you name it. A humidor for his cigars. They called them cigars and misspelled them S-E-G-A-R, figures, here in Vicksburg. And, of course, you had this nice little table cigar lamp, see, left standing, lit now. Of course, that's another source of fire in the house, naturally. And bear in mind that most people in those days were dipping snuff. That's a gentleman's spittoon over there on the floor. It has a lip up around it to catch what's coming its way, but 9 times out of 10, he hit the floor of the table behind it. Now, Queen Victoria despised the use of smoking materials at her court, so she forbade the use of it, but she did allow people to dip snuff, and she dipped snuff herself. It was considered very chic for the ladies of 1850, and these are the old Paris porcelain parlor spittoons for the ladies. The difference in the shape being was they leaned over theirs, holding their big skirts well back. They had no dry cleaning. They had to be careful, right? Now, the gentleman would sit in a gent's chair that has arms. The ladies couldn't do that. She would sit in an armless chair, just like you see here, and see there's no arms, and the big skirt and hoop would rest around her on the floor. These were made up in New York City by John Henry Belter in 1840. They're solid walnut in the Rococo Revival style. Belter was the foremost cabinet maker in the North before the Civil War, and I want to point out to you that later on he reinvented the ancient Roman idea of laminating wood together to form plywood, and he took sheets of rosewood and made rosewood plywood, steam bent the pieces and heavily carved them, and this is what you see the result as. You'll see his later pieces are very, very, very ornate. Of course, the Romans used their plywood to make shields, but there you go. Now, our foremost cabinet maker in the South was a man called Prudent Millard, who had a shop down in New Orleans, down on Royal Street, and the trademark for his factory is the half duck egg, and you see it up there on that piece, on the lower shelf, on the recamier, the elegant lady seating piece, and twice on the etagere. The ladies would have used the recamier. This is one of the very few times that she would have been comfortable in her whalebone or steel stays. Remember, this was very constrictive, and it made it very hard for her to bend over in any shape or form. That's how they got that 14 to 17-inch waistline that was popular by the Civil War. But she would have sat on this thing, picked the hoop up, got her feet up, and reclined a little bit, and she's not going to hop off of this every 5 minutes to get to the ladies' spittoons. So she had a spittle cup sitting right next to her, and of course that's the ladies' snuff box of the period for the women. Nice, huh? Now, too, the porcelains here, Chamberlain Worcester, these are the serving pieces to a dessert service for 18, made in England in 1840. And the Bohemian glass luster and the doll and the chair are all original to the house. And she's dressed according to the fashion of the time. Remember, the ladies could show ample amount of decolletage, plenty up above, but never an ankle. All that had to be covered up. They had pantaloons, they would have had an under petticoat, then the hoop, 8 to 14 or more cotton petticoats, then the gown. All this could stand out wider than she was tall. In a formal ball gown, like you might have seen in Washington or Atlanta, you could have had a wing spread, ladies, of up to 80 inches. You can possibly imagine this, but that's why the furniture is always placed around the perimeter of the room. The doorways in these houses were broad, the staircases were wide, even the front doors were double in this house so they could be opened up to allow the gowns to come in. So, too, any kind of musical instrument would have found its way into the room. They had things like concertinas, banjos, mandolins, guitars, fifes like you see here. It didn't matter to them, but always a piano. And an upper-class family like the Bobs up here would have had a chickering. That was the Steinway of that day and time. These have a cast iron harp, a metallic sounding board in there, and they make they hold a tune very well. This one was actually made in 1853, and it still plays. See, it speaks for itself. And take a look, too. The parlor grands were very popular because they didn't take a lot of room up in the room. And look how the legs are far apart, see, so the big skirt could go up underneath there and wouldn't be any problem. And, of course, when the young lady was playing the piano and all this decolletage was on display and her bows were clustered around her, the chaperone in the room, probably sitting somewhere over there, would have made sure she had her silk fichu or shawl tied around her neck, and in such a fashion. You had to be demure at all costs in those days, ladies. Now, too, that's some of the handicraft of the time for the young women. They made silk flowers, wax fruit, fashioned them into arrangements, and covered them over with the bell jars. That simply kept the soot off of these things from the fireplace in the winter months, and of course the oil lamps in these rooms were smoking up all year round. Stop and think, in the summer too, the windows over there are wide open, and all that filth from the train was coming in here. And remember that McRaven Avenue, where the house gets its name, was an unpaved city street. So every time a cart or a horse went by, in came all the filth. So you can imagine how dirty these things would have been. And that's not all that got into these rooms. You've got to remember the open sewage at the time. You had the barn barns over there, the stables, the privies, smoke houses, servants' quarters, all of this kind of stuff right around these houses. Inside these buildings, people had no personal forms of deodorant, no dry cleaning, and of course they were dressing their hair with bear grease, right? Oh yes, the average man bathed once a month, a clean person once a week. So they used potpourri all around the house trying to combat all the foul odors associated with the rooms. You could have smelled Scarlett coming in the room if she had existed. Now too, that jardiniere is Sèvres porcelain with ormolu mounts, and it's from France, and the painting above it is French. It's by Antoine Watteau, who was court painter to Louis XIV, the France's Sun King. This was certified by Christie's of London and New York when it was brought into the country, and there are 3 others in this nation, but they're all in museums up in the north, so it's nice to have one represented here down south. Now this piece of artwork was done by Thomas Sully, and this is Martha and Grace Coolidge. These were Natchez ladies, and they had this portrait made for Dr. Frank Harrington down there as a token of esteem for having pulled them through a bout of yellow fever. Now traditionally in those days the doctor expected this. Firstly in a form of tribute, but much more importantly to him, in an advertising sense, these were lined up to the ceiling all around his medical office. Prospective clients like yourselves would have come into his rooms and thought, well, he's a pretty good doctor. Look at, he's got my mayor, he's got my banker, my father-in-law, whatever, so you'd go to him. Just like when you go to a pediatrician's today, you see the school photographs of the children that he's taking care of. See, so none of these things are new, they're still doing it. Now, normally the ladies of the period had hair long enough to sit on, and when they did them up in these arrangements, that was their crowning glory. But during bouts of fever and illness, which they called ague in those days, they believed that long hair sapped their energy and strength, and they would cut the long hair off. See? Okay, well, nonetheless, look how they've taken a curling iron and worked their hair up so it looks like they've got more of it. See, they saved those long tresses of hair, and they made them into false braids, buns, or curls that they wore at a later time. The lamps in here all burned benzene, which they thought was a wonderful lamp fuel because in this period it was smokeless and it burned very steadily, unlike the earlier lamp fuels. But we know now that this causes cancer and leukemia when it's breathed in the vaporous form, and they didn't know this. And this is why people dropped like flies from the 1880s onwards from what they called consumption. You've read about this for years, all throughout school that you talk about this. This pair of lamps here came out of the Chateau de Tuileries in Paris and belonged to King Louis Philippe of France. I'm going to show you a matching tea service upstairs with one of the cups inverted, showing you the king's marks when we get up there. But nonetheless, if you will just quickly look around the room, look at all the reflective surfaces out on display. Oh, all of this was used to help bounce and reflect light around these dingy Greek Revival structures. Remember that the overhangs of the galleries outside, the big porches, helped draw breezes in, and it shaded the house. The heavy drapery work in the windows, you know, overhangs, to say, of the galleries, all made for dark and cool rooms. So they were just doing what they knew best to make it brighter in here. See, that lamp in the center of the room was never turned on in the summer months. That'd be like having your central heat on when it was 100 degrees outside. They burned those things in the winter only. But nonetheless, the mirror behind me is original to the house. The wedding clock, look at all the shininess here, the shininess of the Carrara marble. Even the chanettes on the hearth helped to keep this big coal burning insert here from looking like such a miserable black hole in the wall. Now, the coal that people were burning in fireplaces like this one was available from the 1830s on, about 1834, when the first stretch of train track was laid in this part of the country by slave labor in 5-foot gauge. And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of history on that, but by the time of the Civil War, that train track had gone all the way over into East Texas, and it had gone all the way over to the eastern seaboard. And during the hostilities, that train track became the main supply route for the Confederate forces east and west, so you can imagine what a target that was for the Union forces.
Well, Mr. Bob's 1849 addition to McRaven not only included the parlor, but also the modern-day entrance to the house, as well as the flying wing staircase, and the front upstairs bedroom, and the adjoining dressing room.
Now, like downstairs in the parlor, we have some Millard furniture up here. The whole suite was made by Prudent Millard, and again, there's his trademark, the half duck egg. As you remember, every piece the man made had it on it. And if you are interested in jewelry, these items over here all came from the 1840s up to about 1895. That's even a piece of Fabergé jewelry from the Russian designer, Peter Carl Fabergé. sign piece, and they all belonged to my third great-grandmother, and she was married down in New Orleans in 1858. That's her wedding fan right there. The combs belonged to her, the dolls on the mantelpiece belonged to her, and her husband's picture and pocket watch and fob were in the next room. I'll show you that later. I'm actually going to show you her picture downstairs in the hallway. Let's take a look around here on the other side of the bed. This is Caroline here, and like some of our Southern belles, she's a bit of an airhead, but she's up here for the purpose of showing you what they wore underneath all of these hoop skirts at that time. Everybody's familiar with the dresses, but they wonder what's up underneath. You know, back in the middle bedroom, we were talking about bathing, and I talked about the shimmy, or the chemise as they were called, that the lady had on in the bathtub. Well, this is it. See, it's a little cotton garment that stopped right below her knees, and they wore it all day, all night long. They would change them once in a while, but nonetheless, the shimmy was on. And she would have pantaloons underneath that and all that good stuff. She had the under petticoat. And take a look right there. You've got the stays. Now, these are whalebone or steel at that time. This is how they actually got that 14 to 17-inch waistline that was popular during the Civil War years. Now, what these women did not realize is that this is what caused so many of the deaths during childbearing years. They had disfigured the rib cages and their internal organs. The doctors at the period would do autopsies and find the livers scarred and all the internal damage, and they would warn people, but nonetheless, fashion prevailed, and they continued to wear them. They wore them right up into the 1920s and the 30s, as far as that goes. But nevertheless, there she is in her glory, under glory, and of course you've got the petticoats and all that. Now, too, remember that it is very difficult for her to bend over, like we talked about in the parlor. So let's come on over here and look at the prie-dieu slipper chair. Now, the prie-dieu is for the people to kneel on at nighttime, to say their prayers. Remember, it did not matter what denomination you were on your knees to say your prayers. So you kneeled on this, knelt rather, leaning against the bolster to say your prayers, and in the morning, the lady sat down low to the floor to do up the button shoes. Now, Caroline over there, remember, has her stays on, so it's hard for her to bend over, and the companies that made shoes and boots in that period realized this, so they put the buttons to the outside. Okay, so you had a button hook like you see here, and you could lean from side to side doing up the button shoes. Of course, why they didn't put the shoes and boots on first, but you know the Victorians had a right way and wrong way to do everything, but this is the way it was. And of course, Caroline's sitting here dipping snuff, so she's got to have her little spittle cup sitting right next to her. And of course, she's wearing her wax-based makeup that she's very carefully applied over here on the dressing table, so she had to have her fire screen, see, to shield that makeup. Now, too, this is Berlin tapestry. This is the most popular form of needlework that, in the 19th century. It's cross-stitch or needlepoint, and see, they've got beads worked over it like you see here. But look above the mantelpiece at this big piece of work that looks like an oil painting, because in actual fact, it's Berlin tapestry too. Have a look right there, because all of this background is single thread cross stitch. The arms, the neckline, the faces, and the hands are all done in petit-point, and there's beads sewn into the sash like you see there. So that represents years of effort as far as it goes. So, you know, needlework was their crowning glory after all. Downstairs in the parlor, we talk about the lamps that belonged to King Louis Philippe of France, and there's a matching tea service up here in the bedroom, and the cup in the middle is turned upside down so you can see the king's marks very clearly. The Chateau de Tuileries mark in orange, the date mark 1846, and the Sevres mark in blue. And like the lamps down in the parlor, these are all signed by Maglan, his court painter of the time. Now, a lot of people come into McRaven and they say, what in the world is something as high-blown as that doing in a house like this in the South? But in actual fact, it does make a lot of sense. Louis Philippe was a constitutional monarch in France, and he was deposed during the February Revolution of 1848, and when he fled France in exile to England, he packed up many of his very beautiful things, shipped them to New Orleans, and they were sold up and down the river to the wealthy plantation owners. After all, this is the area of the world that had all the money in those days. They were trying anything they could do to marry their sons and daughters off to our families over here to get the money. But nevertheless, this is a lady's dressing table. Look how much lower it is for the lady. And see, the mirrors in here are long for her, and there's no furniture out in the middle of the room because she had to be dressed standing in the middle of the room with her hands over her head, right? The servant took lifting poles and picked those petticoats up and the gowns up, see, and put them over the top of her head one after another. But that's how they got dressed. And the man was in his dressing room adjacent to this. And before you ever laid your hand on the doorknob in those days, men, you had to actually knock dear, are you decent? You had to ask to get back in. Yes, Mr. Bob, they would say. Come in, Mr. Bob, you know, you may enter, all this sort of thing. They called each other dear husband, dear wife, you know, Mr. and Mrs., all of this kind of stuff. But nonetheless, let's have a step in here and take a look at what's in the dressing room, okay? Okay, we're back in Mr. Bob's dressing room. Take a look here. It's just big enough for him to get into. A man of that period would have used this room, not a lady. She probably couldn't have got in through here with her hoops on. And after all, Queen Victoria scandalized the entire staff at Windsor when she went in 1860 with her husband and found him in the dressing room and watched him be shaved. And the entire staff of Windsor could not believe that a woman would have the nerve to set foot into the inner sanctorum of a gentleman's dressing room. But this is Mr. Bob's dresser right here. Look how much taller it is than the ladies, all made of rosewood, like the furniture downstairs and in the bedroom. And the shaving rack up here folds up and out of the way when it's not in use. There's a shaving mug, brush, razor, strop, and up there is General French. That's my third great-grandfather who was here in Vicksburg, and up there's his pocket watch and fob. But look down here, of course, he wasn't supposed to be smoking in the house, as we all know, but nonetheless, he had a cigar book all hollowed out, you know, for his cigars. Maybe he'd stick his bottle of whiskey down in there, or possibly some of his money, all folded up and stuck in the shelf. With the door closed, his wife had no idea what was going on in here. Let's take a look over there, because that's something that everybody had. That's the commode of the period. See right here? This all pushes back, see, you know, and closes like you see. Some people would call it a nightstand, but nonetheless, the man would have had that. And right there is a chair for the gentleman. See, it's got arms, don't forget, and it's got the antimacassars on it. Remember, they used bear grease or they used macassar oil, and that stopped the grease from getting on the upholstery and on the arms from his hands. And of course, you could boil those, but you couldn't boil the upholstery. And take a look. The toys all belong to the Murray family. They're original to the house. And these are 3 more of the original Currier and Ives prints. And there's yet another one over here of Jenny Lind, the Swedish nightingale who sang in Vicksburg in 1844 at Frazie's Saloon. Look at her hair parted nicely down the middle, greased into place. Check out that waistline. Probably sang right through her nose, right? She certainly didn't sing from her diaphragm. And of course, look at how much décolletage she's showing. Actually, Vicksburg was quite a cultural center during this period. We had French chefs in the restaurants. We had an opera house. We had all sorts of people come to this town and play. Everybody from Oscar Wilde and Sarah Bernhardt came. You had the Booth, Junius Brutus Booth, the famous Shakespearean actor. We had all sorts of people come. Let's start on down the stairs, and as we do, hold on to the handrail and take note how much lower the handrail is in this house than it is in a modern home. Come on with me. As we come down the staircase, if you'll take a look over the edge, you're going to see that there's no visible means of support all the way down. This is a flying wing staircase, and it was the most popular form of stairway construction in the 19th century. Now, it's cantilevered in construction, like Frank Lloyd Wright, but much earlier. All the supportive elements come out of the bearing walls of the building, just like teeth on the end of a comb. Every step is locked up, back, tied into the one behind it, all the way back up the staircase, and that's why you feel relatively little or no movement as you come down. Now, the stair treads and the risers, just like the floors in this house, were made of cypress for practicality, but the spindles and the railings were made of solid walnut. Now, they took a solid block of walnut, put it into a block vise, and began steaming and bending it with clamps, just like you see here. When they got this all into the desired curve, they let it dry, then they hand-carved and pegged it. It's all pegged in the beginning, in the middle, in the end of the curve, and where it goes into the newel post at the base of the staircase. There are no screws or nails in it anywhere. It's doweled together like a great big jigsaw puzzle. Now, over here on the landing is another Rogers group. This one's the Merchant of Venice, right here. And the man with the beard pointing at the document, playing Portia, not this one here, is Edwin Booth. He was the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated and murdered President Lincoln. And as we come down to the base of the stairs, you're going to see another Rogers group. This one's called the Council of War. Here on the right is Secretary of War Stanton polishing his glasses, and there's General Grant on the left. And of course, this is President Lincoln seated in a chair that was proportioned to somebody of my stature. Would you look at him hanging out of this thing? He was 6'4", wore a 14 boot and a 40-inch shirt sleeve. Now, he actually had acromegaly, which is a disease that affects the pituitary gland. And had he lived on and the disease took him, he would have died a very painful and tragic death. So in actual fact, it was a kindness that he was murdered before the disease actually took him over. Now, as we all know, that couldn't have been worse for the Confederacy because Reconstruction was terrible as far as that's concerned. But take a look above here. Here's another cheerful item in the house. This is a mourning wreath. Symbolized the fact there was a death in the family. Okay, see the family circle shown as being broken up there? This one's made of cotton. Sometimes there were wool, even human hair was used. And of course that's all on a black background to indicate mourning or death. That's Mrs. French up there. Remember the lady with all the jewelry? Well, nonetheless, there was one of these things for every member of the family that passed away. They were around these houses like wallpaper, right? They were very proud of them. And of course, right there are her surviving daughters, all lined up like birds on a fence. See, hair parted down the middle, neatly greased into place with bear grease. And look at all this black bombazine fabric that's never seen a dry cleaner's. So you can well imagine what these people were like. But these are all mourning pieces, even the mourning jewelry up here. So you ladies were in black so long you had to have the black and gold jewelry to go along with it. Now take a look right here. This fixture is original to the house, but it has been raised because the average height of our gentleman guest has gone way up above my stature. This thing ought to be hanging down where I could easily reach that candle ring, unscrew that, light the candle that was inside, screw it back into place, and see that glass smoke bell? That stopped the soot from rising up and getting under the medallion and turning that all black up there. Okay, well over here, under the staircase, we have a sociable, or a dating sofa. And this is where the courting couple would have sat and had their courtship period, which was a year and maybe longer. Some of these people were betrothed from childhood on. But nevertheless, when the young man went to court and spark his young lady friend, he would stop off by the florist and have a tussy-mussy made. Now, that didn't matter whether it was fresh or dried flowers. What did matter was the choice of flowers, because they all had a language and meaning of their own. So roses stood for love, lily of the valley for purity, aloe for mourning and grief. If you didn't like the fact that she started dating another beau, you could hand her a yellow rose, and that meant she was fickle, so you could tell her everything, including off, in those days by the choice of flowers. But nonetheless, the couple would sit out on either end of this thing. The young lady would be contemplating his sentiments and warding off the evil smells, which I think everybody has figured out were plentiful at that time. And 9 times out of 10, an old crone like me or a younger member of the family would come toddling in from the parlor or wherever, sit down between the couple and lean back out of the way, allowing the couple to talk over the head and shoulders. Now, you were never left alone till after you were wed, and if you were caught together unchaperoned, that was grounds for marriage. No, regardless how innocent that was it. If the young man refused to marry the young lady, he was branded a scoundrel and driven from town, and that reputation followed him all over this countryside. And the young lady was now relegated down to the class of a fallen woman. Damaged goods. No man of her own class was going to have anything to do with her. So unless there was a cousin somewhere on the horizon to get married to, it was spinsterhood from that point on. And spinsterhood was no joke either. You know, real spinster means the person that sat in front of the spinning wheel, spinning and weaving, dyeing and making the fabric and clothing for the family to wear. That's what she did the rest of her natural life, or the option to this was the convent. So they guarded their reputations with their lives in those days. Look there, there's Romeo and Juliet, and the nurse acting as the chaperone, getting ready to yank Juliet away from Romeo there.
Then came the Civil War, and Vicksburg was a strategic city.
Vicksburg was also just more important. By the time the Civil War came along, it was more important than just because it was a river town, because there were a lot of river towns that just really didn't make any difference. Why was Vicksburg so important to both the Confederacy and the Union during the Civil War?
Because of the railroad across the Mississippi River there. It crossed over into Louisiana and on over into the west, and they could run supplies back and forth through Vicksburg. Of course, they had to cross the river there at Vicksburg, and they could run supplies over into the heart of the Confederacy from the west there. And, of course, that was the way that the Confederacy was kept going, was through this beef that was coming out of Texas and the grain and such as that to feed the armies with.
By the time of the Civil War, that train track had gone all the way over into East Texas, and it had gone all the way over to the eastern seaboard. And during the hostilities, that train track became the main supply route for the Confederate forces east and west, so you can imagine what a target that was for the Union forces. Now, Vicksburg was referred to as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, and Lincoln himself called this the key to the war. Whoever held the key would win the war. And that's exactly why General Grant was sent here with his 45,000 men. He was to come here, get control of this town, knock out that blockade that we had going on north of here up on Fort Hill, and knock out this train track. And on the 22nd of May, 1863, he pitted his forces, all 45,000 of them, against us out here in the battlefield. And the one place that they nearly managed to break through and get into this town was straight up that train track at the battle site of the railroad redoubt. Now, that's where the Texas Monument is here today. If you were to get out on that train track in front of the house, it would take you between 2.5 and 3 minutes to actually walk up there. We're that close to the lines. Well, nonetheless, the 22nd Iowa came in and took about a dozen Confederate prisoners, and the 99th Illinois came in from behind and started taking their Union flags and planting them up on top of the fort. And while all this was going on, Lieutenant Colonel Pettus came from the 2nd Texas Lunette over here with volunteers from Colonel Wall's Texas Legion, and they were trained with the Sharp's carbine rifle, which was actually one of the most accurate guns of the Confederacy. They came from the behind the lines right through here, got on that train track and went up to the fort, got into it, expelled the Federals, and regained it for Vicksburg. But as you know, that did us no good whatsoever. We were surrounded, and 147 days later, we ran low on foodstuffs, which was nothing more than pea meal bread, mule meat, and rats. And we had the worst drought in the history of this town in June of that year, and we were forced to surrender to General Grant on the 4th of July, 1863.
There was a lot of cave life going on. Of course, you know, they fired those mortars just about round the clock from the river out there, and those mortars were 13 inches in diameter, the mortar balls. They weighed 220 pounds, and when they would explode, you had huge chunks of iron going everywhere, and if they didn't explode, they made a, well, Samuel Lockett, the chief engineer, measured one of the holes, and it went 18 to 20 feet in the ground. And so, you know, the people in town, they used those against the town mostly, and the people in town had to worry about that. So they lived in caves underground for fear of the mortars, and also shelling by the batteries. The Union Navy put guns across the peninsula over there on DeSoto. And also the shelling all around the lines back there. It was just almost a constant artillery barrage in Vicksburg, keeping everybody demoralized. Food ran short.
Okay, if you'll just take a look up here at the shell mark in the wall, a cannonball came up during the siege of Vicksburg and landed in the wall and frightened the Bobs out of the house and probably out of their minds. They were staying downstairs in the basement, which is now a modern kitchen facility. And they went to a local siege cave just about a block away down from this house. And this cannonball stayed in the wall right up until 1950. If you'll look up here, though, look at all the repair work in the molding. You can see cracking and patching in every area of this room. A cannon shell came in from the corner of the room there, and it struck the cypress floor, just completely demolished it, and the Bobs put heart pine down in its place just to get this place livable once more. When the shell came, it struck. Look how it cracked the marble hearth and it dislodged the fireplace a bit from the wall right there. There are cannonballs like those in the windowsill, still lodged in the beams in the attic above us, but all the charged or explosive shots have been removed from McRaven because of the safety factor, right? Just bear in mind, during that 47-day period of siege, that they were firing from the river 6 blocks away, firing from the north, the east, and the south, trying to hit around this house. This house was being used as a staff officer's camp and a field hospital. You probably could have seen it from the Union lines from the east. Well, nonetheless, they were trying to hit that train track in the fort behind us. 124 mortar shell holes were counted in this one room alone during the first restoration in 1960. And the house was so severely hit with the roofs taken, the galleries knocked off, laying out there in splinters. The place was just, you know, gaping holes, just terrible, that some of the post-war accounts said that McRaven was destroyed. But Mr. Bob up here was 60 years of age, and 10 months after the siege, he was trying to make the repairs to this building, make it livable once more, and on the 18th of May, 1864, he found 6 drunken Union soldiers out here on the grounds. Now, these were trained troops from Louisiana by the Federals, brought here for occupational duty, and there were 6 of them out here, drunk and disorderly, laying waste to Mr. Bob's 11 acres of strolling gardens that were then known as the Pride of Vicksburg. There's 5 acres to the house now, but nonetheless, Mr. Bob was outraged by this. He ordered the men off of the grounds, and an argument started up. He ended up driving them off of the property, and he foolishly picked up a brick from the walk and hurled it at one of the men to get them to leave, and he knocked one of them down. Well, they turned on him and swore they would come back and get him and burn his house, and he realized that he was in the wrong. So he went right up the street to General Slocum, who was in charge of these forces, and he reported the incident. Well, Slocum took the whole thing very lightly and sent Bob right on home unescorted. As he came down to the 4-way stop, that's where the gates to the house used to be, he was met up by 25 of these men, led off down to Stout's Bayou about 100 yards away, and he was shot in the back and in the face. And Mr. Bob's murder here goes down in our local history as being the first recorded act of violence perpetrated against a private individual by Union troops after the siege. And I want to point out that that went unpunished, and his wife Selena was afraid to stay on in this house. Now, she had had no children by this man, and she was stripped of her servants like all Southerners were. And bear in mind that her home stood way outside of town in the county with all this wreckage and carnage on her doorstep, so to speak. You probably could have actually smelled the battlefield from this area. You have written accounts of that during the period. But nevertheless, she managed to get herself a military pass somehow, and she packed herself up and moved off to their plantation outside of New Orleans called Sunnyside, and she would never return to live in the house. But she rented it out, and it finally sold, and in 1882, a Mr. William Murray purchased the house, and he had come down here during the occupation period as a teamster. And he had met and married a Vicksburg girl, an Irish immigrant named Ellen Flynn, and they married, and together they raised 4 daughters and 3 sons in this house. Now, 2 of the daughters stayed on in McRaven as very eccentric, elderly spinster recluses, living here till 1960 with no modern conveniences whatsoever in the house. And in 1960, Miss Ella Murray passed away in the house at the age of 81, and her sister Annie over here sold this house lock, stock, and barrel and moved off to the nursing home. And the only thing that she wanted from the house was her father's walking stick. And when she passed away at the age of 89 in 1972, she returned it to the house. But I want you to bear in mind that the sisters lived here as recluses and in a very, very sad state. They had no modern conveniences in this place except a telephone out in the hall. They really never threw anything away. There were newspapers stacked in here and possessions gathered from 1860 to 1960. Little paths cut through the room, and they finally ended up in the dining room in here, using that as a bed-sitting room. And when they could no longer make it outside to the old kitchen, they were cooking in the fireplace in there and chopping up the antebellum furniture for firewood. 6 of the dining room chairs went this way, and so on down the line. And I would like you to take note that the bed's original to the house, but if you look at the upper 2 regions of the molding up top there, on this end and on this side over here by me, both of these are replacement. When Annie Murray sold this house for restoration in 1960, the new owners came in here and found the charred remains of that downstairs in the fireplace below, where the sisters were chopping up the antebellum furniture and burning it for firewood. As I mentioned downstairs, 6 of the dining chairs went this way and so on down the line. There was a wisteria vine growing up the side of the house, over the mattress, out into the magnolia tree. Oh yeah, it was about this big around. They had to hack that out before they could start the restoration in this room. Now, as amusing as the Murray sisters may appear to some, we always like to make it very clear that they were responsible for keeping McRaven totally original and authentic from the Civil War period. It was their efforts and their living here that saved this house, and it is the only house that can actually say that it's never been changed and altered or modernized in any shape or form from that period, and be truthful about it.
So, after Mr. Murray passed away in 1911, McRaven fell silent for nearly a half-century, locked in a time capsule in the hands of Mr. Murray's 2 daughters, who refused to acknowledge the passing of the decades. But in 1960, Miss Ella Murray passed away, and Miss Annie Murray, her surviving sister, moved into a nursing home, selling McRaven for restoration as a tour home, and leaving it as the only unmodernized antebellum home in Vicksburg, and it still is to this day. Now that brings us up to date on McRaven, transcending the periods of Vicksburg's history from its hillside observation vantage point. Except we really need to add a postscript. Is it any wonder that a house so rich in history will not easily let the past rest? And McRaven is noted for constantly bringing back former occupants and events of yesteryear.
One of the old jokes before I bought the house was with the tour guides was to come running up here to watch the tourists come in and see the expression on their face when they saw all this very bad plasterwork. Well, Teresa Winchell was in here waiting for her couple to come up, and they never showed up. And when she finally went looking for them and found them back in the front section of the house, they said that they had followed a young lady with long brown hair back up to the front section. Well, Teresa had medium-length brown hair, and it was pulled up in a French twist, and they took a look at her and said, well, it's obviously not you, and you're not dressed the way she was, and Teresa asked if they wanted to see the rest of the house, and they said, we think we've seen enough, and left. You know, we're coming back into the 1836 section of the house.
Okay, now this was built
obviously after that. Right after that. That's 1797, but built by Andrew Glass. This is 1836, built by Sheriff Stephen Howard of Vicksburg. And of course, this is the room where Mary Elizabeth Howard, his wife, died in 1836. This room is extremely active. If we come on over here, take a look. It doesn't matter what lamp you plug up and how many electricians test the electrical outlets, this is the one that goes on and off at night at will. It just does it. This is anybody's guess. See, the police would show up here all the time. Way before I got the house, they'd come in and the lights would be all on, the neighbors would call. See, and they'd call the owners, and they'd have to come over here, or the head tour guide, see, who has keys, and come in and look all around the house. See, I'm the first one to live in it since it's been restored and put on tour. This room, one of the things that has gone on for, since 1960, like so many of these other things, is the fact that the piano stool will come out from underneath the piano on its own power. You'll put it back under the piano, go out of the room, come back in, and there it is out in playing position. This last summer, around the 4th of July, a group of, and we'd love to hear back from some of those tourists that experienced this, if they managed to hear this tape. But nonetheless, a group of tourists were in here with one of the guides, and the lady asked if the piano played. And the guide said yes, and the lady reached over and hit middle C, and nothing happened. Well, they went out, started to go out of the room, and just as they were closing the door, the piano broke out into a beautiful tune, and they all came running back in here, and there was no one sitting at the piano, so that was kind of fun. When I bought the house, about a month after I bought it, Mr. William Murray followed me up here, and I spotted him here. And of course, I had the house blessed right after that by the local Episcopalian priest, and I hadn't seen him since.
Who are the spirits who haunt this house? Any ideas?
There are many, many. All we can tell, each section seems to have its own crew. As far as it goes, literally. You've got stuff going on in the back section. We have no idea. We presume that Mary Elizabeth is doing the light thing in here, although we don't know. Yeah. The walking out on this front gallery, see, that would be their section of the house, could be Howard, it could be anybody. Yeah. But see, there's walking continually out there, you'll hear it. So, and up front, the things that happen, we know that I've seen Mr. Murray. I've seen his two daughters, Ella and Annie Murray. And as I say, countless other people have seen these. And it's not just me, it's been documented by many. You see, this stuff goes on during the day with the tourists here, at night, you know, whenever. It's a very active place. When you walk around the grounds at McRaven, you've got lots of pretty plants to look at and all that. You can actually see them now. But when this house was first sold for restoration in 1960s to the Bradways, this place was a veritable jungle. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face in here. In fact, it was so overgrown all the way up to the street. There were people on Harrison Street that lived out there that had no idea there was a house standing back here in the woods. Now that honestly went on for over 20 years, if you can imagine. And during the restoration, a lot of Vicksburgers were shaking their heads saying, Remember the post-war account, some of them said the house had been destroyed during the siege. Well, it was so overgrown, they said, oh, it's not even back there. And this is really what attracted the National Geographic magazine to get interested and do something with the house. They were here doing a comparative study on the siege of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg. And they got interested in the house. They did the accreditation work on it. They proved that it was Mr. Bob's residence. They got it on the National Register, and they featured it in the July 1963 edition of that magazine, as you see here. And we've been a tour home ever since 1961, open to the public, and it was unlived in until 1984 when I bought the house, and now it is lived in on a daily basis. But still in the 19th century style, because I have to go outside, downstairs into the basement for a modern kitchen, and of course there's a bathroom facility down there too. So McRaven still resembles as it did itself from the very beginning, untouched and unscathed by modern hands.